a new phenomenon. He was used to seeing the lights on his property that would be off in the distance that would disappear, and you know, he had previously seen that kind of like fighter jet thing that was scanning the area. Like, those are two types of lights he would see, but there was a new light he saw as he's sitting on his porch. It was almost like this orangey orb that appeared off in the distance. Since he had his rifle with a high-powered scope on it, he just lifts up his rifle and he looks through his high-powered scope and he zooms in all the way, and he can see that this orb, he describes it as a portal. That as he's looking at it, it has almost like an oval shape to it, and even though it was nighttime, in the middle of the orange orb is this blue sky. It's as if he's looking through a portal into another world where it's broad daylight and there's a sky. And he doesn't know what to make of it, but he can see that a black figure is crawling out of this portal into his property, and it looks just like the black entities that were kind of basically walking around his property at night. In addition to these figures that are crawling, like imagine that scene from The Ring where the girl crawls out of the well. They're crawling out of this portal into his property and then scurrying away into the tree line. And he sees weird craft as well coming into his property through this portal, and then the portal shuts and disappears. Following this night with the orange portal, Terry started to notice blue orbs that he and his family would say were the worst and most terrifying thing of all of the things they experienced. And considering they had tall, featureless black humanoids peering in their windows and rapping on their windows, that's saying something, okay? So a blue orb started showing up on their property. And the way they described it, Terry and his family, was whenever the orb came near you, it gave you this extreme sense of anxiety. It was almost like it was emitting this feeling that you automatically got where suddenly you were unbelievably anxious and terrified of the blue orb. And then as soon as it left, you would, not be anxious anymore. And so one night, he's sitting on his porch like he had begun doing, and he sees this orb show up on his property. And his 3 dogs are sitting with him that see the orb, and they start growling and barking. And so he lets his dogs go, thinking that maybe they can scare this thing off. And the dogs take off running towards this blue orb, and they chase it, and you can see the orb, Terry can see the orb that starts to kind of retreat. And he's thinking, oh my goodness, I finally won something. My attack dogs are gonna scare this orb away. And they chase off into the woods, and he sees this thing, the blue orb, retreat into the woods. And then when he's thinking, again, that finally, a little victory for us, he hears his dogs yelping. And he's too terrified to go check it out. And so he ends up going inside and locking the doors, locking the windows like they had been, and just kind of retreating. So the next day, when the dogs haven't returned, Terry and his son, they go out looking for the dogs in the forest. And when they get out there, they get to a clearing, and they find 3 stacks of ashes in like little burned out circles, as if there had been a fire previously in these 3 little spots. And it turned out it was the ashes of his 3 dogs that had gone into the woods. They had just been vaporized. Terry decides that it's time to leave, and he wants to sell the ranch. And so he puts the property up for sale and goes to a local news outlet, and he tells them about what's happening on his property. And as fate would have it, a billionaire by the name of Robert Bigelow, who had invested millions of dollars in standing up this scientific research team, this all-star team of PhDs, specifically to research what he described as high strangeness, which really is just paranormal. Basically, he was obsessed with the paranormal and wanted to investigate the paranormal, and he had actually seen that fairly obscure story. When he saw that it was up for sale, Robert Bigelow, the billionaire, saw this great opportunity to buy the piece of property and actually make it the headquarters of his own scientific research team. Not only to investigate what was happening on Skinwalker Ranch, but use it as kind of a hub to do other scientific research. So he purchases the ranch, and Terry actually, even though he did not want to spend any time at the ranch, on some level wanted to know what the research was going to show, because he was very curious, like, what is going on at this ranch that's been plaguing my family. So he offers to stay on as kind of like the ranch manager, because Robert Bigelow and his team are a bunch of scientists and business people. They don't have any experience on the ranch, and so they're happy to keep him. So Terry is still connected to the ranch, but at this point he's sold it to Robert Bigelow. So Robert Bigelow's scientific team was called the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, N-I-D-S, NIDS for short. And Bigelow had actually built the team before purchasing Skinwalker Ranch, and what he went out and did is he recruited some of the most incredible scientists and PhDs he could possibly recruit, but he didn't want people that were interested in the paranormal. He wanted people that were inherently skeptical, so that if he was ever able to kind of prove the existence of high strangeness, that he would have credibility in doing that. And so he went out and found these incredibly skeptical, incredibly smart scientists and PhDs. And so they move into Skinwalker Ranch, and the first thing they do is they need to start doing testing to make sure that this whole all the stories about Skinwalker Ranch coming from Terry and his family were not just some grand illusion by the family that, you know, they could have just made it up. And so they get in there and they start running these tests. So that first year, as they're running these tests, which are largely things like, okay, let's check the environment and see if there aren't any, you know, plants that are giving off spores that could be hallucinogenic that they're breathing in. Let's check their water supply and make sure there wasn't something happening in their water supply. Let's do psychological assessments of the family. Let's ask neighbors. Let's do all of our diligence to make sure it's not something environmental or psychological. And over that first year, while they're doing this research, there isn't much activity at the ranch, save a couple of instances where there were some strange lights. So that first year is fairly uneventful, but what's important is that the NIDS researchers come to a conclusion that this did not seem like a hallucination. This did not seem like a something coming from, you know, a plant or water supply. This seemed like the Terry and his family were really experiencing something odd. They just didn't know what it was. One day, Terry and actually Gwen, who was helping him, were tagging some of the new calves, the new cows that had been born, putting these little tags in their ears. And so Gwen was there helping. And so Terry and Gwen, they tagged this new calf, put a yellow tag in its ear, and they move on and they're tagging other animals. And so for about 40 minutes, their eyes and their attention are not focused on this one calf or that one area of the ranch. They're tagging other animals, and then their dog that was with them starts growling and reacting in the direction of where this calf had been. And so Terry and Gwen turn around and they look and they don't see anything. And they start walking over. They find the calf that they had tagged about 40 minutes ago has been basically surgically dissected, and all that's left are its legs and its head. And in addition, the ear where that tag was had been removed. And so they immediately call over the NIDS researchers. So the NIDS veterinarian comes over and looks at the scene and just can't make sense of it, because the incisions on the calf were so well done that it looked like someone with real surgical expertise had done this on an operating table. There was no sign that this was done by a predator, and there was no blood anywhere. So this prompts a massive search of the property, because in many ways this is what the NIDS researchers are looking for, are real occurrences of something that is highly strange that they can go investigate. And so all of the researchers and everybody there begins searching the property for whoever was responsible for this dissection of the cow. And they start searching the property, and the dogs, they had all these guard dogs that were kept at each of these observation posts that they had set up around the ranch as soon as the NIDS team had moved in. They were all looking in the same direction, all four of these four observation posts, and they're all cowering in the back of their cages, all looking in the same direction. And so they start making their way towards the tree line where all these dogs are looking. And they stop short when Terry says, "I see something in the tree." So they stop their car and they're looking. And in the tree is this massive wolf, this like wolf-like humanoid that's basically perched on a tree limb. And Terry takes out his rifle and he aims at the creature up in the tree, this huge creature. And everybody sees it. All the NIDS researchers are looking at this creature and they're like, "Oh my God, what is that?" Terry starts firing at this thing and it just disappears into the woods. And so the team charges into the woods, they fan out, and they pick up a couple of tracks of this huge thing that has like this massive footprint with these huge claws. But much like the wolf that had disappeared and the cattle that had suddenly disappeared when they went into the woods, they couldn't find any traces of this thing. But they did smell this horrible stench that Terry remembered smelling. It stuck with him that first day when that large wolf had come over on the very first day they were moving in. It was that same smell. But they couldn't find this huge animal. So dumbfounded, the NIDS researchers just go back to the property and no one can make sense of it. And you know, they have the footprint and they have their own eyewitness testimony, but like they couldn't make sense of how something that big could just get away. And so over the following month, they're like searching the property and they're looking for any more signs of this huge creature or anything. The only thing they noticed is that the guard dogs consistently stayed in their kennels and did not want to come out. They were acting like they were kind of being hunted, and they were they were cowering quite a bit, and they were scared to go out in the open, but they couldn't find anything. So it was around this time that Terry and Gwen are kind of back to doing work around the ranch, and one day they're driving off to one section of the ranch and they pass by the corral where 4 of their prized bulls were. These are very expensive animals that are all in this enclosure. And so they drive past and they take a mental note that they're seeing these bulls in this enclosure, and they drive off to the other side of the ranch where they're doing some work, you know, tagging animals and, you know, building fences, whatever it is they were doing. But when they come back and they round a corner where they're first able to see that corral of bulls again, they are like, where are they? Because the bulls were not in their enclosure and they weren't anywhere. And so they're panicked because these are very expensive animals, and they run over, and Terry sees that the gates to the corral are still locked, but there's no bulls in there. There's no sign of a struggle or anything. And it just so happens that right next to the corral was this fairly small trailer that hadn't been used in years. In fact, it was literally wired shut. It was just sitting there. And Terry, just for whatever reason, runs over and looks in one of the windows. And inside of this tiny enclosure are these 4 bulls, completely calm, all crammed into this tiny trailer. They could barely fit. They're not fighting with each other or anything. They're just calmly sitting there as if they're in some kind of a trance. And Terry yells to Gwen, like, hey, they're over here. They're right here. And it like startles the bulls out of their trance. They start panicking and kicking, and they end up getting them out of this enclosure, and it takes them hours to finally round them up and get them back in the corral. But they're unharmed. But it is almost impossible to get even one bull into that small of an enclosure. It would take hours to maybe be successful at doing that. To get 4 bulls into that enclosure was pretty much impossible. And to do it when they basically were calm after they were in there is also somewhat impossible. And it was important to note that Terry saw when he looked in the window that the only entrance to that trailer was wired shut still. It had not been undone. In fact, the cobwebs at the corner where the opening basically formed with the sides of the trailer, they were still intact, like it had not opened. And it made no sense how those bulls got in there. And so the NIDS researchers come over, and they can't make sense of it either. Upon further investigation, the NIDS researchers found that the bars of the corral that held the bulls, a section of it had been highly magnetized. And so while they're doing this research, trying to figure out if magnetic fields has anything to do with the strange occurrences at the ranch, 2 of the NIDS researchers were on the outskirts of the property using their compass to look for magnetic fields. And they started smelling, they both reported smelling that horrible metallic, like rotting smell that other people had reported smelling anytime they saw that large wolf creature. And when they started smelling it, their compass started to flitter and then pointed away from north towards wherever the smell was. And they remember thinking that they felt like they were being watched. And it went on for a few moments, and their compass didn't waver. It was aimed in the direction of the smell, and they're both on opposite sides, pointing in the same direction. And then at some point, the smell stops, and they stop feeling anxious, and the north arrows go back to the way they should have been. And then one of the most terrifying of all of the paranormal occurrences that happened at Skinwalker Ranch happened at the very end of 1997. 2 NIDS researchers were up on a ridgeline overlooking the homestead. Every night it became commonplace to basically position NIDS researchers all over the property to basically be on the lookout for weird things that are happening. And these 2 researchers are up on this ridge, kind of obscured and hidden, and they see this orange orb take shape right near the homestead. And one of them had infrared goggles, and so he looks down at the orb, and he can clearly make out that it's this oval-shaped opening that sounded an awful lot like what Terry had seen on his porch when he saw that humanoid creature crawling out of the portal into his property. Well, these 2 researchers are looking at this portal, and they see the same thing. They see this black human-like creature crawling out of this orange portal onto the ground, and then it starts running up the hill towards them. And they're like frozen with fear. They start smelling that horrible rotting metallic smell as this big human-like creature bounds up the mountain, and they can hear the shale under its feet as it runs up, and it goes right past them. About 30 feet away from them, they're looking at it, and it just barrels past them at a full sprint up into the mountainside. The following year, in 1998, the activity on the ranch declined significantly. All they had was the occasional strange lights here and there, but for the most part it was done. And in fact, even though NIDS remained on the property, by 2004, the research just wasn't amounting to anything, so they pulled the plug on the operation. They did have footage of a number of the lights that were seen, but again, no one's going to take a picture of some random lights and say, oh, there you go, proof. You know, they demonstrated that there were, magnetic fields, and they have images of these calves that would reappear after looking like they'd had surgery done to them. They had hundreds of eyewitness reports. They have all this information, but none of it was really definitive proof, which was very frustrating to Robert Bigelow, to Terry and his family. And the way they described it is they felt like they were dealing with an entity or a group of entities that were just consistently one step ahead of them. That they could catch glimpses of what they were doing, but it was never enough to really understand what was happening. They never felt like they were in control. It was always clear that this entity or these entities were in control of the situation, and they never were in a good position to really record hard data or get good footage. Not to mention, this is 1998, this is the late 90s. No one just had an iPhone they can pull out and snap pictures. You had real cameras. And so the best they could do was some pictures of light and some of the animals that had been mutilated. There's been numerous books put together by some of the people that were a part of this NIDS research team, and to this day they believe that what they saw was a result of some paranormal activity. And to this day, many people believe that this is one of the most credible instances of paranormal activity occurring. So I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, whether you think this is a total fact or a total hoax or somewhere in the middle. I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Also, I post quite a bit on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen. And that's going to do it, guys. I hope you got something out of this. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.